knock this out. All right, so the NAR settlement changes went into effect in Michigan in our market, Steve, over a month ago. We were early to this thing, but they just went into effect nationwide on August 17th. So this is kind of like the first full week of seeing things being implemented. There is, and I don't even want to get into this, but there's still mass confusion from, loan officers and real estate agents on how to implement the changes. But today I want to focus on specifically how would a buyer agent structure an offer? How would you structure the loan as it relates to the situation where a buyer agent or a buyer would find themselves in a situation where they would have to pay their buyer agent commission? And you and I were talking about that last week. And I think that there's some really interesting, fascinating things that you can do from a loan officer's perspective to help the buyer agent in that situation that I haven't seen anybody talk about, quite frankly. I have not seen anybody talk about the things that you and I were talking about last week. And so I said, dude, we have got to share this with the real estate agent community. For nonetheless of again, I don't think the situation will be that prevalent. I really don't, because I think that most of the time through the offer negotiation, it will be the seller who is paying the vast majority of buyer agent commissions moving forward. But in the event where that buyer has to pay the buyer agent for whatever reason, there's some really interesting things on how you can structure the loan to help that buyer and buyer agent with that. All right. So that's kind of what I want to focus on today. So I've got my iPad. If it makes sense, I can kind of walk people through the numbers and map it out visually. But let's start to talk through how they might want to structure that.
Sure. So, there's a couple things you could do, right? And so the buyer that we're talking about in this case is, like you said, the buyer that cannot get the seller to pay for these through the normal offer negotiation, and now they're paying them on their own, and they want to, right? They see the value in their buyer's agent, and they're saying, we're going to pay this 3%, but we don't have the money, right? Here we are, we're first-time buyers, we're putting down 5% on this transaction, and we simply don't have enough money for the 5% down. And I'm going to talk about a loan. I'm just going to give you a scenario here, and maybe this scenario, it's not everybody's same one, but for me, it's one I just did, and I just using some of the numbers off it. So this was a $460,000 home.
Before you get into that, do you think it would be beneficial for the audience to, as you're speaking it, I can show it on the iPad and kind of walk them through it at the same time? Would that be beneficial?
Yeah.
Do you think? All right, so let's do that. All right, I'm going to go like this. You can see my screen, right, Steve?
Yep.
All right, so let's just go through this. We don't have to rush through it. But number one, the purchase price you're saying, right, was how much?
Yep. $460,000.
All right, so $460,000 was the purchase price. Okay.
And they are putting down 5%, which is a down payment of $23,000.
Okay.
Their closing costs are $11,000. So that's including setting up your escrow account, doing all that stuff, right?
Okay.
And their base rate on that loan without them paying any points is 6.125%.
Got it.
As far as excellent credit, they've got all the goodies. So the payment's important here. So with their PMI included, their monthly payment does not include taxes and insurance, is $2,725 a month.
How much? I'm sorry?
$2,725.
All right. So that's going to be principal, interest, plus PMI.
Yes, sir.
Perfect. Okay. I'm with you so far. Got it.
All right. So there's a couple things you can do here. So one of the things that I brought up last week is that they don't have the money, right? So how can I, as a lender, help? So we have to figure out somewhere where I can contribute. So one thing that we look at with the buyer,
sorry to interrupt one more time, but to your point, the reason why this is coming up, though, why this is going to help realtors so much is in this example, what's most important is their cash to close in this scenario was the 23 plus the 11, correct?
Yes.
All right. So we got 23 and 11. So that's 34,000, correct?
Yep.
And what we're talking about here is this buyer says, dude, I've got $35,000 to contribute to the purchase of my home, and I need this payment. That's what we're talking about, correct?
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
So what we can do as a lender in this scenario is look at them and say, okay, so if you're committed to paying your agent, and here's how I can help contribute. I can't pay 3%. You really, as a lender, it's tough to do too. But if I'm going to go to that borrower and say, look, I know you're in a bind and you need to pay the commission. One of the things we can do is we can go back. If I bring your rate up to 6.625%, that's going to allow you, I can give you a 1% credit toward your closing costs, right? So that frees up that $4,300 for that agent, for that buyer to pay that agent at a cost to them, right? So it's a cost to their payment. So when you're looking at it and you're looking at your ratios, and obviously this conversation you have with your buyer, but in that scenario, we're increasing the payment from that $27.24 a month to $28.67 a month. So you're talking, yeah, $140 is a chunk of money. However, if you're in an agreement with your agent, you've signed an agreement with them, and they've gotten the home under contract and they've executed things, and that's part of your obligation is to pay that agent. I'm always, as a lender, I'm trying to think of ways, how can I keep the transaction on the rails and contribute to that borrower being able to pay that agent at the same time? It's not the full 3%, but it's just one little inch that you can use it, that I can use the relationship that I have with that agent. Like, look, here's another rate option for you. And some days it may be 6.125 to 6.5, might be to 6.125 to 6.625, but it's using some of those credits that you get by taking a higher mortgage rate to help out with that closing cost.
Yeah, makes total sense. And to your point, why would the buyer do this? It's because maybe that buyer says, okay, well, I can swing another $120 payment per month, but I can't swing on top of the 34,000 cash to close. I can't swing another 5,000, another 10,000. And so this comes up all the time where I've gotten questions numerous times. Well, what if I and the buyer sit down, they've agreed to pay me whatever fee I charge. In this case, let's just say as an example, I agree to represent them in this transaction at 2.5%, making up the number. And we've got the seller to agree to pay 1.5. And so now there's this percentage point where the buyer says, well, I don't know how this is going to work. I don't have the extra funds. This is a solution that you just generated that helps the buyer pay for their service that they wanted to hire the agent for and not have to come out of pocket with any more money. That's exactly what we've just outlined with that 1% discrepancy. Because the question always is, well, if I can get the seller to pay me, some of it, but not all of it, how would I structure that? That is exactly what we've just done. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. All right. So that's one way to do it, right? There's another way to do this as well. And so I want to talk about what it looks like to get seller concessions, seller directed concessions towards buyer's closing cost. And then how does that actually show up when you're actually structuring the loan?
So good point. So you can do two things. So there's and I think, and I could be wrong, that certain states vary on what they allow. But as far as like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, I know VA hasn't been official yet, but they usually follow Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. They've come out and said that, because the feedback you get from agents is that if I need my commission paid as seller concessions, right? If it's a seller paid closing costs and they're limited to 3% seller concessions, then, as a buyer's agent, if your buyer needs that 3% to get closed, but you need your 3% to get paid, you're out of 3%, right? And so the one nice thing is that the buyer's agent commission is considered a customary fee in a transaction. And so that is held separate from the regular seller paid closing costs, or that 3% limit. So that can be factored in or negotiated upfront the same way a seller concession could be toward a closing cost. So you could, if you have an offer and you've got an offer negotiation with no seller concessions, you could look at it and say, okay, well, if I can get you two seller 2% in seller concessions, which in this case would be $6,600 or $8,600, then that buyer could use their other $8,600 to pay that seller or that buyer's agent commission, right? So you can really once you've opened the door to getting some credit from the seller, whether it be for seller closing costs or buyer agent commission, you can really use those kind of interchangeably in there. I know that some cases there might be some difference in um, uh, addendums or certain forms you have to provide. Although I don't really know how. If you're getting 2% as seller concessions, and then you want to pay the 2% buyer's agent commission yourself, and the seller's not paying it directly, I don't see how you'd have a different form for that. But that's not my wheelhouse.
Yeah. So here's kind of what this would look like, right? So in the example where a seller has the purchase price of the home, 460,000, right? And in the example of, let's just say, because again, I think a lot of agents get creative. Well, what if this and what if that? And they come up with all these different scenarios and all these what ifs, things that rarely happen, but let's just explore it. They say, well, what if, my buyer has agreed to pay me and I can't get any of it from the seller? Then what, Brandon? Well, what we're talking about, Steve, is, okay, so we have this, the purchase price of 460,000. You can see this, correct? Oh, Steve, did I lose you?
Yeah, I got it. Yep, you're good.
Okay. And then we've got a buyer agent commission in this case to say, okay, well, it's 3% or $13,800. So where's this going to come from? Well, here's what you can do. You can structure a new purchase price, right, of $473,800. And what happens is we subtract out in a seller concession, right? We could say, okay, this is the new purchase price minus a seller concession of $13,800. The seller is still left with their $460,000, and now there's a $13,800 credit that's going to go to the buyer. Now, well, Brandon, how is that going to work? Doesn't the house have to appraise? Absolutely, the house has to appraise. And so, yes, that the house has to appraise. That's one way to structure it. That's how we used to structure this all the time. Or you may split that with the seller to say, okay, well, if you give us 1.5%, well, now instead of adding all 13,800 on top of it, you just add half of that, right? So 13,800 divided by 2. So that's $6,900. You can add that on top of the purchase price. Yes, the house has to appraise, but what we're talking about is giving you solutions on how you might structure your offer such that everybody wins. Now, of course, everybody has to agree to this. We're giving you just different ways to make this work. For the agents that say, well, what if this, what if that, what if this, what if that? There's no magic wand to make anything perfect, but that's another way to do it. Is that right?
Yeah, I would add two things here. So one thing that's really important, because you're talking about the appraisal and adding this to the purchase price, and I know negotiating's tough, and especially with this new normal, right? But it's important that you have this concession conversation and you do this at the time that you offer on the house, because
Right.
in from a lending perspective, I can't order an appraisal for a purchase transaction without sending that appraiser the purchase agreement. And so whenever an appraiser goes to a house for a purchase transaction, they are aware of the purchase price of the home. So the way that is approached is that they're saying, okay, does the market support this purchase price? So if I send them a $460,000 contract, like you'll notice as realtors, I'm sure you notice, unless you're sleeping all the time, that most of the time your appraisal comes back at your contract price. And agents to me are always like, man, don't you think that's weird that happens that way? I'm like, no, it's not. They have your contract. They're like, that's kind of what they're shooting for. Like they're going to make, if it doesn't support it, they'll tell you.
Price. They're justifying
Exactly.
the contract price. It's not like a refinance. Yep.
Absolutely. And so when you're making these offers, you want to have that increased purchase price. Do they look at the contract and see concessions? Absolutely. They even note other homes that are used as comparables in appraisals, how much they actually received in concessions. So the amount of concessions from those transactions is listed in all the other comps. So they see all these things and they're aware of that. But if they can support that purchase price, they will. They may not support all of it. and you may not be able to get it, but it's better off starting that way than coming back. Like I have another loan in process right now where the closing borrower had an issue. It was a weird thing. Closing costs went up and the agent's like, hey, can we just raise the purchase price and get some concessions? I'm like, well, the appraisal's already back. I can't. Like it appraised exactly at the purchase price. So that's really important to get that done up front as much as you can. I had something else too. I forgot what it was.
Well, maybe this will prompt it, because I think the other argument is, well, why would the buyer agree to this? Well, again, I go back to how I started this episode. I am under the belief, and I'm getting a lot of pushback, but I'm under the belief that sellers will still be the ones who pay the vast majority of buyer agent commissions. That will just be done in the negotiation. What we're talking about is in the off chance, in the 0.5% of times, or you can't get anything from the seller, how you might structure that. Well, why would the buyer do that? Well, it's first off, all of you, the buyer agents that are making this argument to me, and I'm giving you the solution, which is this. Well, why would the buyer do that? Well, here's, check this out. And while I'm doing this, can you do me a favor? Just run 2 different payments at 6.25, one at 460,000 and one at 473,800 for me real quick while I'm talking through this other part, Steve.
Yep. Yeah.
All right. Well, why would the buyer do this? We'll check this out. Option number one. Okay. I am not even saying that I'm a proponent of this. I'm just saying for the agents that keep arguing with me, well, what if we can't? What if we can't? Okay. Well, here's what you're saying. So option number one is when your buyer agrees to compensate a buyer agent commission. Again, I'm just using whatever. I'm just using 3% as an example. It could be any amount. Whatever you negotiate with the buyer. In this case of this purchase price of $460,000, we're talking again $13,800. Well, option one is for your buyer to come out of pocket with $13,800 in cash. That'd be the option number one. Option number two is to roll that into the purchase price, like we talked about. Well, why would the buyer do that? I'm going to share with you why they would do this right now. So if they come out of pocket of the $13,800, their payment, Steve, on the full 460 is how much?
$2,690.
And that's at 460. Okay, and then what would their payment be at the 473, 800?
$2,771.
2771. Okay, now let me walk.
$81.
Okay, watch, Realtors. It's an $81 difference. So here's the question. Why would the buyer choose option two to increase the purchase price to roll in essentially the compensation that they're agreeing to pay you? Again, it's you with your buyer. You've got to explain this. It's an $81 difference. And so you have to ask yourself and your buyer, would you rather, okay, one, have $13,800 in your pocket, or two, have a payment that's $81 more per month? Well, the way that we do this is we calculate a break-even point, which, Steve, I'm sure you've probably already done. So if we take those two, what is that break-even point? How many months of saving that money would it take to get that $13,000?
170 months.
And then if we divide that by 12, it's how many years?
14.
14 years of saving $81 per month in order to save $13,800. So the question that you have to ask your buyer is, Mr. Buyer, would you rather have $13,800 more dollars in your checking account, or have a payment of $81 more per month? Given that if you choose to put the cash up front, it's going to take you 14 years of saving $81 per month to get that $13,000 back. This is why most buyers would choose to say, no, dude, I'd rather keep my 13 grand in my hand and have a payment $80 more per month. Steve, your thoughts on that?
I agree with 100%. I mean, that's like the refinance conversation with everybody. Here's a no cost loan. Here's a loan with cost. Here's what your break even is. And as an agent and as a buyer right now, there's no better time, as you know, in speaking like property values and appraisal values, for something like this to make sense is getting it to be able to execute it in the transaction by buying,
Yeah.
high enough property values and things like that.
Yeah, and I only bring this up so that the buyer agents out there that I don't know, have an emotion around these new NAR settlement changes going into effect. I've gotten so many messages on Instagram. Well, what about the buyer agent? What are you only talking about the listing agent? What about the buyer agents out here? What do you not care about? I'm not saying that at all. Today's episode is all about the buyer agent. It's all about Steve and I giving you practical ways of implementing the new NAR settlement changes in the event you cannot negotiate the seller to pay for your compensation. We wanted to give you a couple different ways on how you may be able to structure this, give you some tools in your tool belt, as Steve always says, so that you can approach the business outside of the box and give you some things that maybe you haven't thought about before. And so those are, I don't know, what do we give them? 1, 2, or 3 different ways on how to structure buyer agent compensation in the event you cannot negotiate the seller to pay for it. Is there anything that you feel like we missed or any other strategies you can think of, Steve, to structure buyer agent compensation when it comes to the mortgage?
Only in that, have the conversation with your loan officer. So if you have a relationship with the person that your buyer is using, or if you don't, make sure you get that phone number, because we want to know all that. You don't want your loan officer to be, hoping that you get concessions just to get them in a house, only for you to say, well, we need it for agent compensation too. Then we can work together and find that solution. But the sooner we know and the more we know about that, the more a lender, because believe it or not, we want to help you too. Like, we get it. Like, it's more money. Like, it affects all of us. Like, lenders only work with buyers agents. So we want to help as much as we can. So the more we know up front, the more we can structure things and make everybody comfortable and get it out in the open and be okay with it.